Hello, good day. This is lesson one for our history of mathematics. So our lesson is early number systems and symbols. So what do you see on your screen right now? Most of you would probably say that what you see is the number one. Well, you're not entirely wrong. This figure that we have on the screen is actually just a symbol representing the number one. You see, numbers are abstract concepts. You cannot touch, you cannot feel, you cannot taste, you cannot see numbers. What you see would be two persons walking together. You can see an infinite number of stars in the sky, but you actually do not see the numbers itself, but you're able to count the quantity of a certain number. And so we have to represent these numbers, and so we created these figures. So we have our Hindu-Arabic system, this representing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We have the Roman numerals system, number system, which we have the I, and so on. And then we also have number systems from China. So this is Yi, Er, San, She, Wu. So these are the symbols that represents numbers. So if we go back in time, let's see how um, historians tells us how we made sense of numbers beginning from a long time ago. So we will be looking at primitive counting and how our ancestors made sense of numbers. The picture that you see here is a picture of modern Aborigines from Australia. They're basically like the native people living in Australia, mostly near the deserts in Australia. Their culture, well, although it's already there is already a lot of modern civilization influence on them, but there is still a lot of their original culture. So historians and anthropologists were able to study a lot of their culture, and they found out that the Aborigines were only able to count to two, with any number more than two being called simply as much or many. So it's similar to how we do it here in the Philippines, di ba may dakita, we say na damu basta more than two. So basically, that's how they tried to make sense of their numbers. So they could count only one, two, and many. Now, this picture here, this is a picture of a native tribe also in the Amazon in Brazil. So this group of people were able to count to six, but they had no independent number names for groups of three, four, five, or six. So if you are going to refer to the number three, you term it as two, one. If you are going to count up to four, or say that there you see four snakes, that you say I see two snakes. So that's how they counted. In Africa, these are the Bushmen from Africa. They were able to count up to 10. However, how they represented 10 was similar to those from the Amazon. So they would term 10 as 2, 2, 2, 2, 2. So that's a really cumbersome way of counting. Imagine if you are going to count up to 20, if you're going to count 30, or even more. Now, these um, counting processes that they do, this is largely affected by how they were living their lives. You see, most likely there was only there's not a lot of things that they have to count. So they did not have to think of very large numbers. If they have to count, probably 10 was already a large number for them. Again, if you would have noticed here, they're living. If you have the Aborigines in Australia, these Bushmen in Africa, in the savannas of Africa, and then the the native tribe in Amazon, what they're living in were um, basically forests, savannas, deserts. So there's not a lot of things that you really have to notice there. So let's say they needed to catch. They needed to catch animals for their food. They would not catch food in large quantities, and so what they needed to count most probably was only up to 10. So, because there was no need for them to think of large numbers, then they did not have to invent ways of counting up to numbers more than 10. So, later on, in some other places, they had to think of keeping track of these numbers. So, one of the easiest ways of keeping track of numbers is tallying. So, di ba when we have our elections, we do the tally. So, that's the easiest way for us to keep track of the number of things that we are interested in. So, tallying was the most immediate technique for visibly expressing the idea of number. So, what primitive people do, or what we actually even still do today, is match the collection to be counted with some easily employed set of objects. So, of course, in ancient times, they did not have modes of writing yet. So what they used were their fingers. They used their fingers to tally, to count. They used shells, stones, and other objects. Of course, now that we have pens and papers and other modes of writing, we can just um, write, the lines when we tally. So one example of tallying that they did was for livestock. So sheep was a common livestock that was being raised by people in ancient period. So sheep would be counted by driving them one by one through a narrow passage while dropping a pebble for each. So at the end of the day, after they counted all the sheep, they would again count all the pebbles and then see how many pebbles they had. Then that represented the number of sheep that they had. So let's just digress a bit into some etymology. So the term tally, so this is basically where the word comes from. When we say etymology, that's where that certain word comes from. So the word tally comes from the French verb tailler, which means to cut, and that's also the same term which the English word tailor comes from, and it's also seen in the Latin word tagliare, meaning to cut. So I don't know how it came into counting when it's from cutting. It is also interesting to note that the English word write can be traced to the Anglo-Saxon ritan, which means to scratch or to notch. So most probably that's how they started. They would scratch a hard piece of object into some other objects, and then that's how they started writing. So the picture that you see here, these are bones with notches as tally marks. This was found in the country of Czechoslovakia, and these bones were dated to be coming from 30,000 BC. So that's basically 32,000 years ago, since we are now in the year 2020 or 2021. So basically, these bones, as you see, there are grooves, there are lines here. These are historians and paleontologists and anthropologists. They think of these as tally marks. Although what the ancient people were counting, they're still debating on it. Some theorize that this was used to count records of their hunts, so how many animals they have hunted. However, because there are groupings here of numbers, there were certain patterns that were found. Some would also theorize that this is actually to keep track of passage of time, the number of days. They seem to coincide with the lunar cycle. So, as you know, the lunar cycle, that's 28 days. It's always 28 days. So 7 days each for each phase of the moon, and then there are four phases, so that's 28. So some of the tally marks here seem to coincide with that. But again, these are a lot of guesswork, hypotheses, so we can't really know. However, again, what's important here is that we can see that as early as 30,000 years ago or 32,000 years ago, there was already a method of counting by our ancestors. In South America, there was an ancient civilization, which were the Aztecs. Um, uh, the Aztecs were also, or Peru was also one of the colonies of the Spanish people, just like the Philippines. Now, when the Spanish came to Peru, they were actually astounded by a um, these knots that people are keeping, and they were what astounded them was that the people keeping these knots were looked like important persons. They were not used as decorations. They were not used as clothing or fabric, but it seemed that they give much importance to these knots. The picture that you see on the lower right. So what you see here make just look like some pieces of strings, but actually these pieces of strings with the knots and the cords, these are actually a mode of. Basically, they did not have a mode of writing, so is what they used as sort of writing. Most significantly, what's happening here is that each pendant of string represented a certain item to be tallied. And then the knots that you see here, ininhira ng mga buhol-buhol nga da, those are the numbers. So basically, you have a one pendant here or one string. This would probably represent, let's say, the number of goats. So if they put a knot here or there, then that would mean that there's this certain number of goats that they are recording. So what you see here, ancient civilizations, they had a need to keep track of things, especially these Aztecs. They had a very rich culture, so there were a lot of things going on in these places. So they had to keep track of those things, and so they developed this system of making sense of the numbers around them. There's also another ancient civilization in the Americas. It's called the Mayan civilization. What you see here, the picture in the upper left, this is called a ziggurat, or basically this is a city, and then the tall structure there, the one that looks triangular, that's called a ziggurat. It's comparable to the pyramids of Egypt. So if you have seen the movie Apocalypto, that's where the movie is. The setting of the movie was from that time when the Mayan civilization was still flourishing. If you also remember back in the year 2012, there was a prediction that the world would end on December 22, 2012. So that prediction was actually from a Mayan calendar, basically from this place. We will be talking more about that calendar, about that number, that date. Um, but yes, the Mayan civilization, it's a very rich culture, so they tried to make sense of a lot of things around them. And doing that again would require a comprehensive number system. Now, the good thing about this civilization is that they had a form of writing, which were hieroglyphs, and then for numbers, they had specific number system. So what you see on the lower right here, these are the symbols that they used for counting. Now um, uh, it's very comprehensive basically. So what you see there is one dot would represent one, two dots two, and so on. And when you go to five, it's one line. If you're going to have 6, then that's one line and then one dot. 7 would be one line and two dots, and so on. So it's a very logical on thinking about these numbers. So now let us go to the number recordings of the Egyptians and the Greeks. Now, these civilizations actually had a very comprehensive um, mode of writing. They had a lot of records. Greeks had their stone tablets. They actually also had papers. Egyptians would also have their hieroglyphs. If you've seen pictures of the pyramids inside were a lot of recordings. There were a lot of pictures on the walls, and actually, those pictures were modes of writing. They were records of a lot of things that were going on during those times. So, this is a picture of hieroglyphs. So, this actually has a story to tell. All those pictures are, um, it's a recording of certain things. So the Egyptians, they had a fully developed number system that would allow counting to continue indefinitely. So what does it mean indefinitely? Meaning that they can go to a very, very large number, which other cultures, other civilizations did not have. So going back to the Mayans, their numbers were actually limited. So when they create one theory about the prediction of the end of the world on December 22, 2012, one theory why that actually happened is that it was due to the limitation of the numbers that the Mayans had. So their counting basically did not allow them to go farther than December 22, 2012 on their calendar. And so because their counting stopped there, they thought that the world would end by that time because they were not able to comprehend what is after that number. However, here with the Egyptians, they can go to very, very large numbers. So this is how Egyptians would symbolize their numbers. So the number one is represented by a single vertical line. The number 10 would be represented by this curve. The number 100 is represented by a curved. This is supposed to be a coiled rope. The number 1000 is represented by this is supposed to be a lotus flower. The number 10,000 is represented by a finger that is bent. That's supposed to be a bent finger. And then 100,000, I forgot what this symbol is. 1 million is a person um, raising his hands up to the sky. And then 10 million, this is actually the sun, either it's setting or rising. So what you can see here is that the increment in the symbols is by powers of 10. So a 1, of course, that's 10 to the power 0. 10 is 10 to the power 1. 100 is 10 squared. The lotus, or 1000, that's 10 cubed, and so on. So let's say we have this writing on the wall. So what is this number in our numeracy? So how do we write this number in the modern times? So to make sense of that, we'll just take a look at the symbols. So the six vertical lines, of course, would represent the number 6. And this is 10 to the power 0. Then the curves, since we have 3, so we multiply that 3 times 10. The coiled rope, there's only one, so we multiply that by 100. And then there are two lotuses, so that's 2 times 1000. There are four fingers, so that's 4 times 10,000. Then this symbol, so that's 100,000. So there's only one, so that's 1 times 100,000. Then we just add them all up, and then what we get is 142,136. Now, with the Egyptian numbers, they can actually also write this um, uh, either from left to right or right to left, meaning the ones place can actually be on the far right, and that we start with the big numbers and then going down, or we can write it as this, from the small numbers going to the bigger numbers. Now, those number symbols that we have seen earlier, those were written on either clay tablets or stone tablets or on the walls. And later on, they had developed the papyrus, which is from, it's like bagabagahin mga grass that are on the marshes, and then they made it into paper-like materials. It's more like cloth than paper, but basically it served like how we use paper today. So with the invention of the paper, the writing before was very cumbersome. So again, if you have to write a big number, you have to write a lot of symbols. So they had to devise a way to make writing numbers shorter. So they invented again new symbols for their numbers. So we have this now. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, up to 10 is now represented by these symbols. And then 20, 30, 40, up to 1,000 were now represented by these symbols. So if we had this number here from the old version, in the new version, so we had, look, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. You had to write 10 symbols here, but in the newer version, you now just have to use two symbols. So these two numbers are the same number. However, the writing um, is now just shorter. Now, the Greeks also had a similar, I mean, they also had their own number system. Um, what they used were their letters to represent their numbers. However, there was a limitation. They only had 24 letters in the Greek alphabet, but they needed to represent 27 numbers. So they actually came up with three new symbols for number 6, number 90, and number 900. So what you see here is just basically alpha, beta, gamma, delta, epsilon, and so on. These are their um, letters, and then they use that for their numbers. By the way, it would be of big help if you would be familiar with all these Greek characters, Greek letters, because as you move on into higher math, you will be encountering a lot of these Greek symbols or Greek alphabet. So try being familiar with them already. So if we have this symbol, what would it represent? What number does it represent? So what we do is simply get the equivalent of these numbers. So basically what the Greeks did before is that they had to memorize what each symbol, what each letter represent in their number system. So the Greek character psi is representing 700, pi represents 80, and delta represents 4. So these combination of Greek letters represent the number 784. And so that concludes our first lesson for History of Mathematics. I'm looking forward to your reports on the other topics that we have for this course. Have a good day, everyone.